What happens when the man who built an empire discovers the one thing he cannot control is his own heart? Nathaniel Cross was a billionaire CEO, admired and feared in equal measure, a man who believed success meant never needing anyone. At his side, for 2 years, was Clara Hayes, his quiet, brilliant assistant, the woman who anticipated his every move, the woman he swore he'd never allow himself to want. But one night changed everything. A night of whispered confessions and stolen touches. A night Nathaniel tried to erase with 7 cruel words. This was a mistake. Forgive me. By morning, Clara was gone, fired, erased from his empire. Only, she carried with her something he never expected: his child. When Nathaniel learns the truth weeks later, he must confront the greatest battle of his life, not against rivals or markets, but against his own fear, pride, and the consequences of breaking the only woman who ever truly saw him. Can love be rebuilt after betrayal? Can a man who once valued control above all else learn to surrender to the family he almost lost? Stay with us as we uncover a story of power, heartbreak, and redemption. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps bring these stories to life. The 58th floor of the Croswell Tower carried a silence that was heavy, almost sacred. From his office windows, Nathaniel Cross could see Chicago stretched wide beneath him, Lake Michigan glinting under the morning sun, traffic pulsing like blood through the city's steel veins. To most, this view was the prize of a lifetime. To him, it was simply another reminder of how far he had climbed, and how far he had left everyone else behind. Nathaniel adjusted the cuffs of his dark navy suit. He was a man built on precision. Every line of his tailored jacket, every polished detail of the mahogany desk in front of him, spoke of control. At 42, he had transformed Croswell Industries from a struggling logistics company into a sprawling empire of steel, shipping, and energy. Shareholders spoke of him in reverent tones. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees rarely dared to call him anything at all. Yet, beneath the discipline and the stone-carved exterior, Nathaniel carried something no one in that tower could see: a weariness carved from years of survival. His father had lost everything in the recession when Nathaniel was only 12. He still remembered the eviction notice pinned to the door, his mother's tears muffled in the kitchen, his father's silent shame. That day, Nathaniel had promised himself he would never again live at the mercy of another man's decisions. Control would be his armor, success, his shield, and weakness would have no place in his life. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Cross. The voice was soft, measured, yet with a warmth that somehow slipped past his defenses. Clara Hayes stood at the doorway, tablet in hand. Auburn hair swept neatly into a bun. She had worked for him for nearly 2 years, and, in that time, Nathaniel had come to rely on her in ways he didn't allow himself to admit. She anticipated his needs before he spoke them, shielded him from unnecessary distractions, and carried herself with a quiet composure that set her apart from the frenetic ambition of the corporate world. She crossed the room with the fluidity of someone who knew his rhythm. Your 10 o'clock is waiting in the conference room. Would you like me to join for notes? Nathaniel's gray eyes lifted from the contract he was reviewing. For a fraction of a second, he noticed details he shouldn't have, the way a strand of hair had slipped loose near her temple, the faint vanilla scent she always carried, the green flecks in her eyes when the sunlight caught them. He pushed the thoughts away. Distraction was weakness. Yes, he said curtly. Bring the file on their last quarter. She nodded, efficient as always. But he thought he saw the hint of a smile flicker across her face before she turned. Clara never wasted words, and yet her presence filled the room more than the chatter of a dozen board members. When she left, Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. He could command an army of lawyers, out-negotiate billionaires, and bend markets to his will. But the simple presence of his secretary managed to chip away at the walls he had built since boyhood. It unsettled him, this quiet erosion. Later that morning, The conference room buzzed with the controlled chaos of corporate theater. Executives shuffled papers, adjusted ties, and cleared throats. Nathaniel entered with his usual calm authority. Clara, a step behind him. She set her tablet down, her fingers flying across the screen as though she were an extension of his mind. As the CFO stumbled over a projection, Clara slid the correct figure in front of Nathaniel without him having to ask. He didn't even glance her way, but he felt it the way she knew his pace, his tone, his needs. It was seamless, unnervingly so. Halfway through, a document was passed across the table. Clara leaned in to place it before him, and for the briefest instant, her fingers brushed his. Heat flared, sharp and immediate, and Nathaniel forced himself not to react. The meeting continued with the usual efficiency, but his thoughts were elsewhere. That night, the city glowed outside his penthouse windows. Nathaniel stood with a glass of bourbon in hand, looking down at the glittering skyline. Chicago was alive, restless, pulsing with stories he had no part in. He thought of Clara again, of the way her eyes met his without flinching, the way her presence softened the edges of his harshest days. It was foolish, he told himself. She was his employee. He was her employer. Lines existed for a reason, yet he could not shake the image of her hands, precise yet gentle, or the quiet steadiness in her voice when the world around him pressed in. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. Tomorrow would be another day of contracts, projections, and power. Clara would walk into his office with her usual grace, and he would play the role of the unshakable CEO. But in the quiet of this night, he allowed himself a single thought he dared not speak aloud. What if control wasn't the only way to survive? What if, just once, he allowed himself to feel? The investor conference was scheduled for mid-morning, but by 8 o'clock, Nathaniel was already reviewing the figures in his office. He didn't trust glossy presentations or the enthusiasm of junior analysts. Numbers, he believed, only spoke truth when you stripped away spin. Clara entered quietly, carrying 2 leather-bound folders. These are the updated quarterly projections and the background on each investor attending today, she said, setting them on the desk. Nathaniel flipped through the first folder. The pages were crisp, perfectly tabbed. Clara's handwritten notes appeared in the margins, short, precise, yet rich with context. She had a gift for cutting through excess and distilling information into what mattered most. You included their secondary interests, Nathaniel noted. Clara nodded. Mr. Rinaldi is deeply tied to green energy initiatives. He'll want reassurance that our logistics division is investing in sustainability. And Ms. Keener. She hesitated. Her husband sits on the board of a competing firm. She'll be watching for weaknesses. Nathaniel's lips curved almost into a smile. You think of everything. Clara lowered her gaze, perhaps to hide the faint pink rising in her cheeks. It's my job, sir. But Nathaniel knew it was more than that. Many assistants were efficient. Few possessed her depth of intuition, her ability to anticipate unspoken needs. It was as though she read the air around him, adjusting her presence with effortless precision. By the time they walked into the 30th floor boardroom, the long oak table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, water glasses perfectly aligned. The investors were already seated, murmuring among themselves. Nathaniel entered with measured steps, his expression calm and unreadable. Clara followed at his side, carrying her tablet, her quiet poise drawing more than one curious glance. The meeting began, projections displayed on large screens. The investors fired questions, probing for cracks. Nathaniel answered with steady authority, his voice deep, unwavering, yet, more than once, his rhythm faltered not from uncertainty about numbers, but from the woman seated beside him. Clara never interrupted, but she was always there. When an investor asked about overseas tariffs, she slid the relevant chart in front of Nathaniel without being asked. When another raised concerns about infrastructure delays, she had already highlighted the solution. Her movements were small, efficient, but Nathaniel felt each one like a pulse of energy. At one point, she leaned in to adjust a document. Her hand brushed his again, fleeting yet undeniable. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough to still the air between them. Nathaniel kept his gaze on the spreadsheet, but his mind raced. It was absurd, he told himself. He had built walls higher than this tower, brick by brick, over decades. No one touched him, not emotionally, not physically without permission. Yet one accidental brush of Clara's hand and his composure threatened to fracture. He answered the investor's question with mechanical precision, his voice steady even as heat lingered at his fingertips. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Clara withdraw, her face carefully neutral, though her lips pressed together as if she too had felt the unspoken current. When the meeting ended, the investors left impressed, some even unsettled by Nathaniel's usual dominance. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he remained seated, staring at the empty chairs, every muscle taut. Clara began gathering the materials, her movements brisk but not rushed. She slipped the folders back into her bag, her eyes fixed on the task. The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of professional routine, but something heavier, charged. Finally, Nathaniel rose. "Send me a summary by this afternoon," he said, his tone clipped, as though efficiency could erase what had passed between them. Clara only nodded. Of course. He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. Alone again. Nathaniel pressed his hands against the table. He could face down hostile boards, negotiate billion-dollar contracts, stare across a courtroom at rivals who wished to ruin him. But the quiet strength of one woman unsettled him more than all of them combined. She is not weakness, he told himself firmly. And yet, why do I feel lighter when she's near? That night, the city sprawled outside his penthouse windows like a constellation of false stars. Nathaniel sat in his leather armchair, a glass of bourbon untouched on the side table. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of traffic 30 stories below. He looked around the apartment, steel and glass, immaculate surfaces, the trappings of power. Everything here was designed to project control, wealth, and status. Yet not a single object offered warmth. No laughter echoed off these walls. No family photos lined the shelves. The refrigerator held imported water and little else. For years, Nathaniel had convinced himself this was the cost of survival. Better to be alone than vulnerable, better to command respect than to risk love and lose it. Yet tonight, as he replayed the brush of Clara's hand, the focus in her eyes, the way she seemed to ground the chaos around him, he wondered if perhaps he had mistaken emptiness for safety. He rose and walked to the window. The city glittered back at him, a million lights, each representing lives filled with joy, sorrow, connection. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, feeling the faint tremor in his chest. The bourbon remained untouched. The bed, when he finally lay in it, felt vast and cold. And in the darkness, Nathaniel Cross, man of control, master of empire, faced the truth he dared not speak aloud. For the first time in years, I wanted someone not because they could serve me, but because they made me feel human again. Lake Ashford Lodge sat nestled among Wisconsin's rolling hills, a sprawling estate of timber and glass overlooking waters that gleamed silver under the autumn moon. For most of Crosswell's executives, the annual retreat was a chance to celebrate profits, cement alliances, and bask in the luxury Nathaniel Cross provided. For Nathaniel, it was another stage, another performance in the theater of power. Clara Hayes arrived 2 days early to coordinate logistics. Nathaniel watched her from a distance during the setup, her calm voice directing staff, her steady hands checking details others overlooked. She moved with purpose, but without the brittle urgency he often saw in corporate settings. There was something about seeing her outside the tower that unsettled him. She looked freer here, less like an extension of his empire and more like a woman carving her own space. On the evening of the gala, the lodge glowed with golden chandeliers and the muted strains of a jazz quartet. Executives filled the ballroom in tailored suits and sequined gowns, their laughter rising above the clink of champagne flutes. Deals were hinted at over cocktails, Alliances formed in whispers near the fireplace. Nathaniel mingled with practiced ease, his smile precise, his words calculated, yet his eyes kept drifting to where Clara stood near the far wall, clipboard set aside, a glass of sparkling water in hand. She wore a deep green dress, simple but elegant, the color bringing out the green in her eyes. Her auburn hair, no longer bound in its usual bun, spilled in soft waves around her shoulders. She wasn't laughing loudly like some of the other women, nor drawing attention with dramatics. But to Nathaniel, she commanded the room in a quieter, far more dangerous way. An executive approached Clara with a joke. She smiled politely, but her eyes flickered away, scanning the room as if searching for an anchor. Nathaniel excused himself from his conversation and crossed the floor before he could talk himself out of it. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his voice pitched low. Clara turned, startled, just observing. "Always observing," he replied. He meant it as a compliment, but the way her lips curved, half amused, half defensive, made him realize how closely he had been watching her too. For a moment, they stood together in the swell of music and chatter. He could smell the faint vanilla of her perfume, feel the tension of unspoken words stretching between them. Finally, he offered his hand. "One dance," Nathaniel said. Clara hesitated. Her green eyes searched his face, perhaps weighing the risk. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. The quartet shifted into a slower tune, and Nathaniel drew her onto the dance floor. His hand rested lightly at her waist. Her other hand settled against his shoulder. They moved with surprising ease, steps falling into rhythm as though they had done this many times before. Nathaniel bent his head slightly. "Do you know what people say about me, Clara?" She raised an eyebrow. "That you don't dance." He almost laughed, a rare sound, rough and unpolished. "That, too. But mostly they say I don't feel, that I'm a machine, efficient, unshakable." Clara's voice was quiet, but firm. "Machines don't build empires, Nathaniel. People do, people with scars, with fears, with something worth protecting." Her words cut deeper than any boardroom insult ever had. He tightened his hold fractionally, his chest brushing hers as they turned. "And what if I told you," he whispered, "that you are the only person who makes me wonder if that armor I've carried all these years has become a prison?" Clara's eyes lifted to his, and for a heartbeat, the entire ballroom faded. No chandeliers, no investors, no empire, just the quiet thunder of her gaze, and the confession he had never given voice to before. The music ended, but neither of them moved. When reality finally intruded, Clara pulled back gently. "We should keep this professional," Nathaniel echoed, the word tasting bitter. The night wound down with speeches and toasts. Nathaniel performed his role flawlessly, but beneath the facade, his mind spun. When the clock struck midnight, Clara slipped toward the elevators, heels clicking softly against marble. Nathaniel followed at a distance. He told himself it was coincidence, but when the doors opened and she stepped inside, he was already there. The space was small, the mirrored walls reflecting truths neither wanted to face. Clara pressed the button for the 12th floor. Nathaniel said nothing, but the silence between them vibrated with tension. "Mr. Cross," she began, but her voice faltered when she saw the rawness in his eyes. "Clara," he said, and the sound of her name in his unguarded tone unraveled her composure. The elevator hummed upward, at the 5th floor. Nathaniel stepped closer, the air tightening. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Clara's breath caught. Her hand hovered over the emergency button, but she didn't press it. Instead, she whispered, "And if I don't, that was all it took." Nathaniel's lips found hers with a hunger that shocked even him. The kiss was not calculated, not controlled. It was 20 months of restraint breaking like a dam. Clara responded with equal urgency, her fingers clutching the lapel of his jacket as though to steady herself. By the time the elevator reached their floor, they were no longer strangers bound by professionalism. They were two people who had crossed a line they could never uncross. The hallway blurred as they stumbled toward his suite, stopping every few steps to steal another kiss, each one deeper than the last. When the door closed behind them with a soft click, it felt less like trespass and more like fate, dangerous, undeniable, and utterly consuming. The suite was quiet except for the muffled rhythm of their breathing. Beyond the glass walls, Lake Ashford shimmered under the moonlight, 1,000 silver ripples carrying the secrets of the night. Inside, Nathaniel and Clara found themselves tangled in sheets, their bodies still trembling from the storm they had finally surrendered to. For hours, they had moved between urgency and tenderness, the hard edges of restraint giving way to something raw, almost reverent. Nathaniel, who had spent his life mastering control, discovered an unfamiliar vulnerability in the way he held her, in the way her green eyes softened when they met his. Each kiss had been a confession, each whispered name a plea. When exhaustion finally settled, Clara lay against his chest, her hair brushing his skin. Nathaniel rested his hand on her back, steadying his breath. He should have felt victorious, the way he always did after sealing a deal or winning a battle. But this wasn't conquest. This was something else, something far more dangerous. "Don't look so serious," Clara murmured sleepily, her voice muffled against him. He almost smiled, almost, "I'm not used to this." Her head lifted slightly. To what? To needing someone. He admitted. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Clara pressed a soft kiss to his chest, as if to reassure him. "You don't have to say anything tonight," she whispered. "Just be here." Nathaniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to drift into sleep with another person in his arms. But when dawn crept through the curtains, the weight of his choices pressed down harder than any boardroom crisis. He woke before Clara, her face peaceful in sleep, her hand resting lightly on his chest. For one dangerous instant, he considered staying, considered letting the morning sun bear witness to a new beginning. Then fear struck. Images flashed through his mind, headlines about scandal, shareholders questioning his judgment, whispers of favoritism, weakness, and deeper still, the memory of his father's collapse, the loss of everything because he had trusted too much, loved too much. Control, Nathaniel reminded himself, was the only thing that kept the world from devouring him. He slipped from the bed carefully, dressing in silence. At the desk, he found hotel stationery and a pen. His hand trembled as he wrote the words he convinced himself were necessary. "This was a mistake. Forgive me." No signature, no explanation. Just 7 words that tasted like ash in his mouth. He placed the note on the pillow where his head had rested hours before. He allowed himself one last glance at her sleeping form. Clara curled gently on her side, hair spilling across the sheets, innocence and trust in the curve of her mouth. A pang cut through his chest, sharp enough to make him falter at the door. But he turned away. By the time Clara stirred, the suite was bathed in morning light. She reached out instinctively, fingers brushing cool sheets where warmth should have been. Confusion flickered across her face as she sat up, scanning the empty room. Then she saw the note. Her breath caught. She picked it up with trembling hands, reading the 7 words once, twice, as though repetition might alter their meaning. This was a mistake. Forgive me. Her vision blurred. She pressed the paper against her chest, fighting the rising ache. For a long moment, she sat motionless, every heartbeat echoing louder than the next. When the tears finally came, they were silent, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. She dressed with mechanical precision, folding her dress back into its garment bag, collecting her few belongings. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, willing herself back into the armor of professionalism. By the time she left the suite, her face betrayed nothing but composure. Inside, however, something had splintered. Nathaniel, meanwhile, sat in a leather chair overlooking the lake from his private study. He had retreated there before sunrise, bourbon glass untouched on the side table. His posture was rigid, jaw locked, as though discipline could drown out the turmoil within. He replayed the night in his mind, the softness of her touch, the unguarded way she whispered his name, the rare peace that had wrapped around him as he drifted into sleep. And then the image of the note, stark and merciless. It was the right decision, he told himself. Clara deserved more than entanglement with a man whose empire could crumble if he faltered. He had protected her as much as himself. He had chosen control, as he always had. Yet no matter how many times he repeated it, the words refused to settle. The bourbon burned his throat when he finally forced a sip down. His chest ached in a way he couldn't name. Control means sacrifice, he muttered under his breath, gripping the glass tighter. Always sacrifice. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Clara's sleeping face, serene and trusting, before he shattered it with ink on paper. And for the first time in decades, the certainty that had carried him through boardrooms and battles slipped through his fingers. If this was victory, Nathaniel thought bitterly, why does it feel so much like loss? The rain had turned the streets of Chicago into a mirror that Monday morning, each passing car spraying water against the sidewalks. Clara Hayes stood in the lobby of Croswell Tower, clutching her umbrella, her reflection faint in the marble floor. She told herself it was just another workday, that the weight in her chest was nothing more than exhaustion from the retreat. But deep down, she knew better. The HR director, Michael Green, greeted her with the politeness of a man delivering bad news too many times to count. "Clara, could you step into my office for a moment?" Her stomach tightened. She followed him down the carpeted hallway, past offices where colleagues nodded politely, unaware of the storm gathering in the next room. Michael closed the door and gestured to the chair opposite his desk. His eyes, usually warm, carried the detached professionalism of someone shielding himself from guilt. "I'm afraid this isn't easy," he began. "Effective immediately. Your position as Mr. Cross's executive secretary is being terminated." Clara blinked. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. Terminated. On what grounds? My record? My performance reviews. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Your work has been exemplary. This isn't about performance. Mr. Cross expressed concerns about compromised professional boundaries. He feels it's in everyone's best interest to make a clean break. The words landed like blows, each one sharper than the last. Clara gripped the arms of her chair, steadying herself. She wanted to argue, to demand he repeat the explanation, but her voice betrayed her. "I see." Michael slid a manila envelope across the desk. "Your severance package is outlined here. 6 months' salary, full benefits for 90 days. Security will escort you while you collect your things." Security, Clara repeated, the word tasting bitter, as if she were a criminal, as if 23 months of loyalty, of anticipating every detail of Nathaniel's world, amounted to nothing more than an inconvenience to be removed quietly. She stood slowly, clutching the envelope. "Thank you, Michael." Her voice was steady, but her throat ached with the effort. The walk back to her office felt like a march toward exile. A security guard followed silently a few paces behind. His presence meant to be discreet, but impossible to ignore. Clara opened the door to her office, her former office now, and saw the life she had built in fragments scattered across the desk and shelves. She began packing mechanically. A ceramic mug her sister had given her for Christmas, chipped at the rim but beloved. A framed photo of her parents at their anniversary dinner, smiling with the kind of ease she longed to feel again. A small succulent plant that had sat faithfully on her windowsill, its green leaves bright against the sterile corporate backdrop. Her worn leather planner, pages filled with Nathaniel's schedules, notes, reminders, evidence of a life that revolved around him. Her coworkers drifted past, whispering, some offering brief glances of sympathy, others avoiding eye contact altogether. A few stopped at her door. "I'm so sorry, Clara," murmured Janet from accounting, pressing her hand briefly before retreating. Clara forced a small smile, grateful but aching. "Thank you." The security guard, A kind-eyed man named Frank shifted uncomfortably. "For what it's worth. Ms. Hayes, folks around here always respected you. You were different. Genuine." Clara swallowed hard. "That means a lot. Frank, thank you." She closed the box of her belongings, hands trembling only slightly. With one last glance at the office, the desk where she had spent countless late nights, the chair where she had sat waiting for Nathaniel's instructions, the view of the city she had shared with him in silence, she turned and walked out. On the 58th floor, Nathaniel Cross stood by his office window, arms folded tightly across his chest. From where he stood, he could see Clara below, escorted toward the elevators, cardboard box in her arms. The sight twisted something deep inside him, though his face remained carved from stone. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he was protecting both of them, his reputation, her future. Yet, as he watched her step into the elevator, shoulders straight, head held high despite the humiliation, he felt a crack widen in the armor he had spent his life building, his jaw clenched, his breath shallow. He turned away from the window, pacing back to his desk, the silence of his office pressing in like a judgment. Control had once meant victory to Nathaniel, but now, staring at the untouched contracts on his desk, the echo of Clara's absence filling the room, it felt like something else entirely. Control means sacrifice, he reminded himself again. But as the elevator doors swallowed Clara from view, the thought returned, sharper, louder, impossible to silence. Why does every sacrifice feel like losing the only thing that mattered? 3 weeks had passed since Clara left Croswell Tower, and the city felt different without the familiar rhythm of her work. The subway rides seemed longer, the mornings heavier, the nights unbearably quiet. She told herself she was fine after all. She had survived worse heartbreaks in life. But when the nausea struck one cold morning, she couldn't dismiss it as grief alone. At first, she ignored it. Maybe it was stress, or the lack of sleep since the retreat. But when her morning coffee, usually her comfort, tasted bitter enough to make her gag, dread coiled inside her. That afternoon, Clara ducked into a corner pharmacy on the south side. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, sterile and unforgiving. She paid for the test quickly, avoiding the cashier's curious eyes, and slipped into the restroom at the back of the store. The small space smelled faintly of disinfectant and old tile. Clara locked the stall, sat down on the edge of the toilet seat, and stared at the unopened box in her hands. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself. "It's just stress." But deep down, she knew. She tore open the package with shaking hands, followed the instructions mechanically, and waited. 2 minutes stretched like an eternity. She focused on the cracked tiles, on the faint graffiti scrawled across the stall door. Anything but the white stick sitting on the edge of the sink. When she finally forced herself to look, the world tilted. 2 pink lines, bold, unmistakable, final. Her breath caught, and she gripped the edge of the sink as her knees threatened to give way. Tears stung her eyes, not just from fear, but from the enormity of what the tiny lines represented. Pregnant. Nathaniel's child. For a moment, anger surged. He had fired her, cast her aside as if she were nothing but a liability. And now this proof of a night he would likely pretend never happened. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "If he doesn't want us," she whispered, voice trembling, "I'll still be enough. I have to be." And then, unexpectedly, something else bloomed inside her. A strange, fierce sense of strength. This life, growing quietly within her, was hers to protect. Whatever Nathaniel had taken, he could not take this. Clara left the pharmacy with her head held higher than it had been in weeks. She didn't know how she would manage rent, medical bills, or the uncertainty of single motherhood. But for the first time since that wretched note, she felt a reason to keep moving forward. 2 days later, she sat in the modest office of a staffing agency, her resume folded neatly on the desk. The agent glanced at her paperwork and frowned. With your experience, you could make double in the city. Are you sure you want this placement? Yes, Clara said firmly. I need something different. By the following week, she was behind the reception desk at Maplewood Community Clinic, a modest medical center in a small Illinois town about 2 hours outside Chicago. The walls were painted cheerful yellow, decorated with children's drawings and handwritten thank you notes from patients. The furniture was worn but clean, the kind of place that put care before profit. Her new boss, Dr. Martha Ellison, a woman in her mid-50s with streaks of gray in her ponytail, greeted her with a warm handshake. We don't have the resources of the big city, Clara, but we do good work here. Folks come from miles around, and we never turn anyone away. Clara smiled, genuine for the first time in weeks. That sounds exactly like what I need. Life in Maplewood moved at a slower pace. Each morning, Clara walked to work past red brick storefronts, where neighbors waved even if they didn't know her name. The local diner, with its cracked vinyl booths and smell of bacon grease, became her spot for breakfast. The bookstore downstairs from her apartment smelled of dust and paper, run by an elderly couple who insisted on slipping her extra bookmarks with each purchase. Her apartment was small, a single bedroom above the shop, with a squeaky radiator and uneven floors, but the windows looked west toward the rolling fields, and at night she could hear crickets instead of sirens. She bought a second-hand lamp, a quilt from the thrift store, and a ceramic vase for the windowsill. Piece by piece, she built a fragile sense of home. Each evening, after a long day at the clinic, she sat at her tiny kitchen table, sipping tea and placing her hand on her still flat stomach. Fear remained of money, of judgment, of raising a child alone. But alongside it was something steadier. Resolve. Her child would not grow up feeling unwanted. Her child would know love, even if it came only from her. Clara Hayes had been many things: secretary, confidant, silent partner in a world that had thrown her away when she dared to matter. But now, she was something else entirely stronger, braver, carrying the promise of a future no one could strip from her. And in the quiet of Maplewood, with the October leaves turning gold outside her window, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be enough. The Croswell Tower loomed above Chicago as it always had, its steel edges catching the afternoon light like a crown. Inside, business moved with its usual rhythm. Executives filed into meetings, assistants hurried through hallways, and decisions worth millions were made before lunch. But to Nathaniel Cross, the tower had never felt emptier. Clara had been gone for over a month. On paper, nothing had changed. Profits were steady, contracts secure, shareholders satisfied. Yet every morning, when he stepped into his office, the silence pressed against him like a weight. His new assistant, Victoria Hale, was efficient in all the ways a CEO could demand. Her schedules were immaculate, her notes precise, her tone deferential, but she lacked something intangible, something Nathaniel had once taken for granted. Victoria never anticipated his needs before he voiced them. She never placed the right file at his fingertips mid-conversation, or softened a tense meeting with her quiet poise. She never left behind that faint trace of vanilla that lingered long after Clara had walked out. Nathaniel caught himself snapping once harsh words over a misfiled document. Victoria apologized quickly, but the flash of irritation wasn't about her mistake. It was about the absence she could never fill. At night, his penthouse high above Michigan Avenue felt cavernous. The glass walls framed a glittering skyline, but the lights of Chicago no longer impressed him. He would sit in his leather chair with a tumbler of whiskey, staring out at the city he had conquered, and feel nothing but hollowness. The liquor dulled the edge of his thoughts, but not enough to erase Clara's face from his memory. He saw her everywhere in the confident tilt of her head, in the way her green eyes softened when she looked at him, in the steadiness she carried into his chaos. He had built an empire by mastering control, but he could not control the ghost she left behind. One evening, after the board meeting, Edward Kane, his longtime friend and CFO, stepped into his office. Edward was 10 years younger, sharp-witted, with an easy charm that contrasted Nathaniel's gravity. He tossed his jacket over a chair and leaned against the desk, studying Nathaniel with eyes that had seen too much. "You've been off lately?" Edward said plainly. Nathaniel swirled the whiskey in his glass, avoiding his friend's gaze. "I'm fine." Edward gave a short laugh. "That's the same tone you used when your father's creditors were at the door. Remember what I told you then. Fine means everything's falling apart." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "The company's stronger than ever." "I didn't ask about the company," Edward replied. "I asked about you." Silence stretched between them. Nathaniel stood, crossing to the window. Below, headlights streamed along the streets like rivers of fire. From this height, the city looked orderly, manageable, yet all he felt was the chaos inside himself. "I built this empire so I'd never be powerless again," Nathaniel said finally. And yet, he broke off, pressing his palm against the cool glass. "And yet, I feel as though I've lost everything that mattered." Edward tilted his head. "Clara." Nathaniel didn't answer, but his silence was enough. "You let her go," Edward said softly. "Pushed her out before you even gave yourself a chance." Nathaniel's reflection in the window was hard, unyielding. It was necessary. "Necessary," Edward echoed. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Nate, I've watched you grind yourself into this machine for decades. You've won battles no one else could win. But for what? To sit here every night, alone with your whiskey, staring at lights that don't care if you live or die." Nathaniel's shoulders stiffened. "This company, this tower, stands because I never allowed weakness to dictate my choices." Edward shook his head. "No, it stands because you believed survival meant solitude. But survival isn't the same as living." Nathaniel turned, eyes narrowing. "And what would you have me do? Run after a woman who has every reason to hate me? Admit to her that I'm not the man everyone believes I am?" "Maybe," Edward said simply. "Maybe you should. You built an empire, Nate. But what's left when there's no one to share it with?" The words lingered long after Edward left, heavy in the silence of the office. Nathaniel sank back into his chair, pouring another drink he didn't need. For the first time, the empire he had spent his life building felt like a fortress he could not escape. And in the quiet, with whiskey burning his throat and the city lights blurring through the glass, he admitted the truth he had fought to suppress. He missed her, not as an assistant, not as an accessory to his power, but as the only person who had ever made him feel less alone in the world. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when Michael Green, the HR director, knocked on Nathaniel's office door. His visits usually came with routine reports, small issues easily delegated. But today his face was pale, his hands gripping a manila folder like it might burn him. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully, "we have a situation." Nathaniel looked up from the financial report he had been half-heartedly pretending to read. "Then fix it." Michael hesitated. "I don't think this one can be handled without your direct approval." That caught Nathaniel's attention. He gestured for him to continue. Michael slid the folder across the desk. "It concerns Clara Hayes." The name hit like a blow to Nathaniel's chest. He kept his face impassive, though his pulse quickened. He hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in weeks, but it lingered in his mind every night. "She is no longer employed here," Nathaniel said flatly. "What could possibly require my attention?" Michael cleared his throat. "Due to an administrative oversight, her health insurance benefits were never fully terminated. She's still covered under Crosswell's plan." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, then corrected. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "That's the problem. She's been using the coverage." Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice sharp. "For what?" Michael hesitated just long enough for dread to claw up Nathaniel's throat. "Finally," he said quietly, "prenatal care." The room went still. For a moment, Nathaniel didn't move, didn't breathe. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible and devastating. Prenatal care, pregnant. His mind raced, calculating. The retreat had been 6 weeks ago. Add the 2 weeks doctors counted at the start. 8 weeks. It aligned perfectly. Clara, his child. A storm broke inside him. Shock slammed into regret, regret into rage at himself, at his cowardice, at the note he had left on that pillow. He had convinced himself he was protecting her, protecting his empire. But now the truth roared through him. He had abandoned her when she needed him most. Michael shifted nervously in his chair. Mr. Cross, there are liability issues to consider. If this becomes public enough. Nathaniel's voice cut through the air like a blade. He stood abruptly, towering over the desk, his control cracking at the edges. Her coverage continues, uninterrupted, quietly. Whatever she needs, she gets. Michael blinked. Sir, the cost. Did I stutter? Nathaniel's gray eyes blazed. If one word of this leaves this office, you will find yourself job hunting before sunset. Michael swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Understood. He gathered his papers with trembling hands and left, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Nathaniel sank into his chair, staring blindly at the skyline beyond the glass. His reflection stared back cold, composed, but beneath the surface, fractured. She's carrying my child, he whispered to himself. The words tasted foreign, terrifying, yet undeniably true. For years he had dismissed the idea of children, too messy, too vulnerable, too human. But this was different. This was Clara's child, the woman who had steadied him without ever asking for anything in return, the woman he had cast aside as if she were disposable. He pressed his hands to his face, exhaling raggedly. For the first time in decades, the weight of his choices pressed on him like chains. He saw her in his mind, Clara, alone, perhaps struggling, carrying a secret he had forced her to bear without him. 1,000 regrets clawed at him. The night he walked away, the note he left, the cold order to HR. All of it felt like cowardice disguised as control. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. He reached for his phone, opening her contact information. The number was still there. He had stared at it countless times in the past month, thumb hovering over the call button, never finding the courage to press it. Now. His hands shook as he held the phone. What would he even say? I fired you for getting too close. But now that you're carrying my heir, let's talk. The thought sickened him. He set the phone down, his chest heaving. Words would not be enough. Not this time. Nathaniel rose and paced the office, every step echoing like judgment. He needed to know where she was, needed to see her with his own eyes, not as a CEO, not as a man guarding his empire, but as the father of the child she now carried. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cross felt utterly powerless. The 2-hour drive from Chicago to Maplewood felt longer than any international flight Nathaniel Cross had ever taken. His Bentley glided along rural highways lined with amber fields and fading barns. But his mind was anything but calm. For decades, he had been master of every negotiation, architect of every victory. Yet, as the town's modest sign appeared, "Welcome to Maplewood, Illinois, Pop." 8-342, he felt like a boy again, about to knock on a door he had once slammed shut. He found the Maplewood Community Clinic on Main Street, tucked between a hardware store and a diner with a faded sign promising best pie in Illinois. The building was simple, 2 stories of red brick with cheerful flower boxes in the windows. Nothing about it spoke of prestige or power. Yet, as Nathaniel sat in his car, he felt an unfamiliar envy. Through the glass doors, he saw her, Clara Hayes. She wore pale blue scrubs, her auburn hair tied loosely back, strands falling around her face. She was bent over the reception desk, gently helping an elderly man fill out a form, her voice soft and patient. Behind her, a child clutched a worn teddy bear, while Clara offered a sticker and a reassuring smile. Nathaniel's chest tightened. She looked different here, lighter, more grounded. The constant tension she had carried at Croswell Tower was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, a peace he had never been able to give her. She was glowing. He sat frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel, afraid that walking inside would shatter the fragile sanctuary she had built. For the first time, he wondered if she was truly better off without him. A sharp rap on his window startled him. He turned to see a woman in her mid-50s with streaks of gray in her hair, pulled into a practical ponytail. She wore a white coat over jeans, her stance firm, her expression protective. Nathaniel lowered the window. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked. He hesitated. "I don't know what you mean." She crossed her arms. "The one who broke her heart." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "You must be Dr. Martha Ellison," she supplied, her voice steady, eyes narrowing. "I run this clinic. Clara works for me. And before you say a word, let me be clear if you're here to wound her again. You'd better turn that car around and head back to your glass tower." Nathaniel's legendary composure faltered. Few people spoke to him this way. Yet, he found himself respecting her courage. She reminded him of Clara, quiet strength wrapped in steel. "I don't blame you for protecting her," he said softly. "But I'm not here to hurt her. Not this time. Dr. Ellison studied him, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. "Then why are you here?" Nathaniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, as though it could steady him. "Because I've been a coward. I fired her when I should have fought for her. I left a note when I should have spoken the truth. And now she's carrying my child, and I can't stand by any longer." For the first time, Dr. Ellison's expression softened, though her eyes still searched his face for deception. "Do you even understand what that woman has been through? She picked herself up after you broke her, built a life here with nothing but grit and stubbornness. She doesn't need you." "I know," Nathaniel admitted, his voice breaking. "She doesn't need me, but I need her. And I need to try to be the kind of man worthy of her forgiveness and our child's respect." Dr. Ellison was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of the clinic filtered through the glass doors, children's laughter, the low hum of conversation, Clara's voice rising gently above it all. Finally, the older woman sighed. "She finishes her shift at 5. There's a diner next door. Dolly's, terrible pie, decent coffee. If you want to talk, meet her there, but listen carefully." Her eyes flashed with warning. "If you hurt her again, Nathaniel Cross, you'll answer not just to me, but to this entire town. We protect our own here." Nathaniel nodded, humbled, understood. Dr. Ellison stepped back, her gaze lingering on him one last time before she returned inside. Nathaniel watched as Clara moved to help a young mother juggling a toddler and paperwork. Her movements were gentle, instinctive, full of a compassion he had never truly valued when she worked for him. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cross, man who commanded boardrooms and conquered markets, felt utterly terrified, not of losing an empire, but of losing the only woman who had ever made him want to build something greater than power. The bell above Maplewood Diner's door jingled as Nathaniel stepped inside. The scent of bacon grease and burnt coffee hung in the air, the kind of aroma that never quite left a small-town diner, no matter how many times the floors were scrubbed. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, patched with duct tape here and there, and a jukebox in the corner sat silent, waiting for a quarter. It was nothing like the five-star restaurants Nathaniel was accustomed to. Yet, he felt more nervous walking into this place than he had facing hostile investors. Clara was already there. She sat in a corner booth, a cup of chamomile tea between her hands. She wore her scrubs beneath a cardigan, her auburn hair pulled back loosely. When she saw him, her posture stiffened, her expression carefully neutral. "Nathaniel," she said flatly. He inclined his head, sliding into the seat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the coffee machine filled the silence, punctuated by the clatter of dishes behind the counter. "You look well," Nathaniel said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. Clara's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You sound surprised?" "I am," he admitted. "I hoped you'd be miserable without me." "Selfish, I know, but instead," he gestured toward her, "you look stronger, happier." Her green eyes narrowed. That's because I had to be. You didn't leave me with much choice. The waitress appeared, setting down a chipped mug of black coffee in front of Nathaniel. He barely noticed. His attention was fixed on Clara, on the fire in her voice that was both familiar and new. I didn't come here to make excuses, Nathaniel began. I came because I need to tell you the truth. Clara leaned back, arms crossed. Then start with this. Why? Why did you throw me away the moment I mattered most? The words struck harder than any accusation in a boardroom. Nathaniel's throat tightened. He stared into the steam rising from his coffee, then forced himself to meet her gaze. Because I was afraid, he said simply. Clara blinked, startled by the bluntness. Afraid of what? Of me. Of what you made me feel? Nathaniel replied. His voice was rough, unpolished. I've spent my entire life believing that control was survival, that needing someone was weakness. And then you came along, anticipating my every move, seeing through every wall I built, and suddenly I couldn't breathe without wondering what you were thinking, what you felt. Clara's eyes shimmered, but her voice was steady. So, you fired me. Nathaniel winced. Yes, because wanting you terrified me more than losing everything I built. She shook her head, pressing her hand against the table as if to steady herself. You left me a note. Nathaniel, 7 words. This was a mistake. Forgive me. Do you know what that did to me? To wake up alone after her voice broke. But she forced it back. I thought I mattered. And you erased me with ink on paper. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He slid from the booth, ignoring the curious glance of the waitress, and sank to one knee beside her. For once, he wasn't the CEO of Crosswell Tower. He wasn't the master of boardrooms or the architect of empires. He was just a man stripped of pride, desperate to be heard. I was a coward, he said, his voice raw. I can't undo that night, or the weeks that followed, but I will spend the rest of my life proving I can be better. Not for me, for you, for our child. Clara's breath caught. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. Don't you dare use this baby as your redemption story, she whispered fiercely. He doesn't exist to fix you. Nathaniel shook his head quickly. I know. I'm not asking for absolution because of the child. I'm asking for a chance to be the man you once believed I could be. Her eyes searched his face, looking for manipulation, for the cold calculation she had seen in boardrooms. But what she found instead was something that unsettled her more sincerity. And yet, I don't know if I can believe you, she said quietly. You broke something in me, Nathaniel. Something I don't know if I can repair. He bowed his head, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table near hers. Then let me help you build something new. Not as your boss, not as the man who betrayed you, but as a man who finally understands what love costs and what it's worth. Clara closed her eyes, torn. The anger was still there, sharp and justified. But beneath it, love lingered, stubborn and unwilling to die. It scared her more than anything that, despite everything, part of her still wanted to believe him. When she opened her eyes again, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. I don't hate you, Nathaniel. That would be easier, but love isn't enough to erase what you did. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then I'll show you. Not with words, but with actions. Every day, until you believe me, or until you tell me to walk away for good. The diner grew quiet around them, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Clara stared at him, this man who had once seemed untouchable, now kneeling in a small-town diner, stripped of pride and begging not for forgiveness, but for the chance to try again. Her heart wavered, torn between pain and hope, between the memory of the note and the reality of the man before her. And in that fragile moment, Clara realized the truth: she still loved him. But love, wounded and raw, would demand more than words to survive. The diner had emptied, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the faint hiss of the coffee pot. The world outside Maplewood moved slowly, twilight deepening into night. But inside the booth, where Clara and Nathaniel sat, the air felt taut with unspoken decisions. Clara wrapped her hands around her mug, though the tea had long since gone cold. She studied Nathaniel, still kneeling beside the booth, his tailored suit rumpled, his eyes raw in a way she had never seen before. For once, there was no armor, no mask of control, just a man stripped down to his truest self. "You say you want to make things right," Clara began softly, but there was steel beneath her voice. "If you mean it, if you want to be part of this child's life, you'll have to prove it. Not with promises, Nathaniel, with actions, every day." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "Tell me how." "You figure it out," she said, meeting his eyes. "Because I won't hold your hand through this. I won't let you sweep in when it's convenient, only to leave when things get difficult. If you're here, you stay. If you're her father, you show her, not tell her that she matters." Her words were sharp, but they steadied him. For so long, people had let him dictate the terms of every relationship, bending to his authority. Clara did not bend. That was why he needed her, and why he had failed her before. "I'll stay," he said, voice steady with conviction. "Here, in Maplewood. I'll scale back at Crosswell. Edward can manage more of the empire. It's time I learned that power means nothing if I can't be the man you and our child deserve." Clara blinked, startled by the depth of his vow. "Do you even understand what you're saying? This isn't Manhattan. There are no corner offices here, no boardrooms to conquer." Nathaniel gave a faint, almost rueful smile. "Maybe that's exactly what I need, to learn how to live outside the glass tower, to build something real." Silence stretched, broken only by the clink of silverware as the waitress cleared a nearby table. Clara searched his face for deception, for the cold calculation that had once defined him. But all she saw was a man carrying both guilt and hope in equal measure. Finally, she took a breath and whispered, "It's a girl." The words landed with the force of a tidal wave. Nathaniel froze, his eyes widening. "A girl." Clara nodded, her hand instinctively pressing against her stomach. "I found out last week. She's healthy, strong." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "And she deserves a father who doesn't run from love." For a moment, Nathaniel couldn't breathe. A girl. His daughter? The thought pierced through every wall he had built, flooding him with emotions he had spent a lifetime denying. His eyes burned, and to his own shock, tears slipped free. He bowed his head, voice breaking. "A daughter," he whispered. "God, Clara, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve her. Or you." Clara's own eyes glistened, though she fought to remain composed. "This isn't about deserving, Nathaniel. It's about choice. Will you choose her? Will you choose us every day, not just when it feels noble?" He lifted his gaze, gray eyes fierce with a kind of determination she had never seen. "Yes, I'll choose you both, every single day. Not to fix what I broke, but to build something new, something better." Clara studied him, her heart warring with memory. She remembered the note that had shattered her, the humiliation of being escorted from Crosswell Tower. But she also remembered the man who had held her as though she were precious, the man who now knelt in a small town diner with tears in his eyes, begging not for power, but for love. Slowly, she reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Then start by showing me. With patience, with presence, with honesty. Show me that Nathaniel Cross, the man, can love without conditions." Nathaniel closed his hand over hers, holding it as though it were the lifeline he had been searching for his whole life. His voice was steady, though his shoulders trembled. "I will. Every day. I will." The waitress, Ruby, refilled Clara's tea quietly, casting a curious glance at the scene but saying nothing. Around them, the diner returned to its ordinary rhythm, the doorbell jingling as locals came and went, the scent of bacon lingering in the air. But for Clara and Nathaniel, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Nathaniel straightened, sliding back into the booth. His pride, once his strongest armor, no longer seemed important. What mattered now was the fragile trust across the table and the life growing between them. Clara sipped her tea, her hand still resting near his. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by fear, but by possibility. A future where love, though scarred, might still be enough to build something new. The October sun poured through the maple trees that lined the quiet street, painting the sidewalks in shades of red and gold. A small white house sat halfway down the block, its shutters freshly painted, its garden dotted with late-blooming sunflowers. The laughter of a child carried through the open kitchen window, pure and unrestrained, a sound that once would have seemed unimaginable in Nathaniel Cross's world. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of burnt pancakes. Nathaniel stood at the stove, wielding a spatula with far less grace than he had once commanded in a boardroom. The griddle hissed defiantly as another pancake blackened around the edges. "Daddy! No!" squealed Lillian Cross, 18 months old, her curls bouncing as she clapped tiny hands from her high chair. Her gray eyes sparkled with mischief. His eyes, unmistakably, but her laughter belonged entirely to herself. Nathaniel sighed, flipping the pancake onto a plate with mock solemnity. "Your father has closed billion-dollar deals, young lady, but he still can't conquer breakfast." Clara leaned against the counter, wearing an old sweatshirt over leggings, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. She grinned, holding out a plate of perfectly golden pancakes she had cooked earlier. "Good thing she has me." Then, Nathaniel smiled at her, the kind of smile that softened all the sharp edges time had carved into him. "Good thing I have you both," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple as he passed by. 2 years had reshaped his life, more than 4 decades of empire building ever had. The Croswell Tower still stood in Chicago, but Nathaniel now visited only once a month, reviewing reports that Edward Kane sent with efficiency and trust. The empire no longer consumed him. Instead, his days were filled with tasks he once would have considered trivial: repairing a fence post, planting herbs in the backyard garden, rocking Lillian to sleep when nightmares startled her awake. And yet, those tasks filled him with a satisfaction no quarterly projection ever had. After breakfast, Clara bundled Lillian into a tiny sweater dotted with sunflowers, and they walked together to the farmer's market on Main Street. Neighbors waved, calling out greetings by name. Mrs. Donnelly from the bakery slipped Lillian a small sugar cookie, while the hardware store clerk teased Nathaniel about his crooked garden rose. Nathaniel accepted it all with humility. Here, in Maplewood, he was not the billionaire CEO. He was just Nathaniel, Clara's husband, Lillian's father, the man still learning how to live a life measured not in dollars, but in laughter and love. That afternoon, he crouched in the backyard, dirt under his fingernails as he tried to coax stubborn tomato plants into order. Lillian toddled beside him, more interested in pulling weeds than helping, while Clara sat on the porch swing, a book forgotten in her lap, as she watched them with quiet joy. When evening came, Nathaniel carried his daughter upstairs, her small arms looped around his neck, her head heavy on his shoulder. He settled into the old rocking chair by the window, opening the storybook she had demanded every night that week. His voice, once sharp and commanding, softened as he read about princesses and dragons. By the time he reached the last page, Lillian was asleep, her breath warm against his chest. He lingered there, holding her, his heart aching with a love he had once been too afraid to embrace. Later, as he joined Clara on the porch, the night air cool around them, he reached for her hand. The maple leaves rustled in the breeze, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. "Do you ever think about what we almost lost?" he asked quietly. Clara squeezed his hand. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful we didn't." Nathaniel exhaled, the weight of his past mistakes still present, but no longer crushing. "The greatest fortune isn't measured in dollars, Clara. It's here in this house, in her laughter, in these moments we almost let slip away." She rested her head against his shoulder, smiling softly. "Then maybe you finally learned how to be rich." He kissed her hair, pulling her close. And as the night deepened around them, Nathaniel Cross, once the man who believed control was everything, understood that surrender, love, and forgiveness had made him wealthier than any empire ever could. The house on Maple Street glowed warmly against the autumn dark, filled with laughter, love, and the promise of tomorrow. And as the story of Nathaniel and Clara closed, one question lingered, not for them, but for everyone who listened. Would you find the courage to forgive someone who once broke your heart, at its heart? Nathaniel and Clara's story is not just about love, it's about courage, humility, and the choices that define us. Nathaniel had everything the world could measure: wealth, power, prestige. Yet he discovered that none of it mattered when compared to the quiet grace of a woman who saw through his walls and the child who reminded him what truly lasts. The lesson is simple, yet profound: success without love is an empty victory. Control, pride, and fear may protect us for a while, but they also isolate us. It often takes losing something precious to realize that the greatest fortune lies not in what we own, but in who we hold close. For many of us, especially as the years pass, this truth becomes clearer. Forgiveness is not weakness, but strength. Choosing to build again after heartbreak requires more courage than walking away. And sometimes, the most ordinary moments, a child's laughter, a partner's steady hand, a family meal, become the treasures that outshine every dollar earned. So, perhaps the question for each of us is this: are we brave enough to forgive, to love, and to begin again, even after being broken? Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to this story. If it touched your heart, inspired you, or made you reflect on life, we'd be truly grateful if you could support our channel. Please remember to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Your encouragement means the world to us, and it helps keep these stories alive.